Good morning, everybody. This is Warren Hewitt. I'm the CEO of the Great Tygerberg Partnership. We're coming to you from the bustling metropolis of Bellville, nearby Cape Town CBD in the Western Cape. I see we have some delegates from outside of the Western Cape, and we welcome all of you to the webinar. We're very blessed with a panel today of highly qualified individual presenters and participants. And I'll shortly take you through who is going to be sharing some of their wisdom and intellectual capital with you guys. We're going to be talking today around a city's identity and how branding impacts a city's identity. I think if all of us opened our minds and imagined some major cities around the world, certain images are evoked in terms of what that city means and how you see and perceive that city. So if we mention New York, there seems to be this positive, can-do, never sleeps, I love New York branding that created around New York City. London, on the other hand, is rain, fish and chips, Englishmen, and financial services, but there are a few other things that go with London and the stiff upper lip. Tokyo, for example, might evoke a sense of high-tech, efficiency. Rio, on the other hand, could be carnival and fun and enjoyment. And interestingly enough, Cape Town has become a major international city, and when talking about Cape Town and the emotions that evokes, it could well be an iconic Table Mountain, the sea, the tourism, the wine, the restaurants, etc. So all of these cities have some form of identity. Now, some of them have been built up over centuries of just living in cities, and then some of them have been very intentionally framed and very intentionally created to evoke that kind of sense and emotion and identity. So we're going to try and unpack a little bit today of what makes up a city's identity, how important is a city's identity, what are the contributing factors to creating that, and how intentionally can we rebrand a city to give it that emotional attachment that stands alone, that's different from everywhere else in the world. Let me introduce you to our panel of experts. We have with us our international panel member, Peter Griffiths. Peter is a global urban futurist at BABLE Smart Cities. I'm pleased to report that Peter is in fact originally from South Africa. He spent a lot of time on the Garden Route to Cape Town, Johannesburg, and now to London, where he works for BABLE Smart Cities. A global urban futurist talking about exactly what the topic is for today. How does he imagine cities differently? As a thought leader and city strategist, he most recently explored how the shared micromobility sector can transition from startup to critical infrastructure at tier mobility. He's worked at the London School of Economics and Political Science. He's worked for the World Bank's Global Platform for Sustainable Cities, so a vastly experienced panelist. Peter, thank you for joining us. We really appreciate your time. Tanya, morning to you. Tanya Busschau is a senior associate at DHK Architects in Cape Town. Now, DHK, for the majority of you, I'm sure are aware, is a significant architectural firm in South Africa, not just Cape Town, and lead a lot of urban design and urban change within the major cities in South Africa. Tanya has 8 years of combined experience in public and private sector, architectural and urban design on different projects. I know she's working on a very important project for us at the GTP currently, and she's going to share a little bit of that information. She's served on the Urban Design Institute of South Africa steering committee, and again, a lovely face to greet us on a Friday morning. So Tanya, thank you for joining us. Alex Jongens is our third panelist, and I'm glad we've got more females than males on the panel. Morning, Alex. Alex Jongens is a consultant in urban development and social innovation. Her focus, she's been working in the NGO sector for a long time. She's worked on some very important urban design projects, social entrepreneurship. She's been involved in a range of localized placemaking initiatives in Cape Town, and also working in collaboration with the city of Cape Town on a very important project in our immediate area around Bellville. So we're looking forward to hearing a little bit about what that project is evoking and how that's influencing city identity and branding. I'm not going to spend too much time unpacking my thoughts. I'm going to get the panelists to get started and start sharing with you their ideas, some of the experiences, certainly Peter from an international experience, Tanya and Alex from a slightly more localized experience, and hopefully the audience and all the participants this morning will learn something for one, but have an opportunity to engage with the panelists and unpack how a city's identity influences both its citizens, its perception, its economic growth, and everything that happens within a city. I'm unashamedly going to be steering a lot of the conversations towards Bellville. That's where we work, that's where we focus. We will be referencing other international cities, but there will be a link to a South African case study, and for us, very, very important case study being Bellville. So I'm not going to delay any longer. Peter, I'm going to hand over to you and allow you to, one, introduce yourself and tell us what you think.
Hi, Warren. Thank you so much for this opportunity. And I should probably say that Cape Town holds a special part in my journey because it was the first city that I actually experienced as a child, and it's what set me on this journey of how do places work. And because my gran used to work in the center of Cape Town, and every now and again we'd go and fetch her. So it's a very big part of my journey. But let me get my slides up for you, and then I'll move on to what it is you've asked me to talk about today. Rather than reminiscing about my time in Cape Town as a child. So I'm here to talk a little bit about exploring city identity and public perception. And you'll see that the photo in the background is not urban at all. In fact, it's one of the few high quality photos I could find on Tygerberg as a region, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. But I think maybe starting, and the starting question is, does brand matter when we think about places? And I'm hoping to convince you that it's a critical piece of infrastructure when it comes to place. And maybe as a starting point, we can try a little exercise. So Dan has a poll in the background, which he's going to run for you. And I think there's slightly fewer cities on the poll, so it'll be easier. But I'm keen to know which city do you think these photos are from in the world? All right, so that actually, yeah, so a lot of you have called me on this. So it is London. So the majority of you are right, but actually a good percentage of you thinking maybe it's Tirana or Belgrade. This is actually just not actually that far from central London. It's East London. And the reason that I raised this is because what we find with place is you wouldn't assume that London looks like this in parts of London. And so in many ways, London can get away with looking like this in a way that actually more cities like, let's say, Tirana or Belgrade, or possibly even Cape Town cannot. And so there's something about brand happening here that allows some places to get away with things that other places cannot. So hold that thought as we go through the presentation. So in a sense, I'm gonna look at this through four kinds of lenses. They're not discrete sections, they overlap, but the idea of digital placemaking. So what is digital? What is the impact of digital on place? Overlapping stories. What is it that makes place unique? I'm going to suggest it's not necessarily the things which are amazing about place. It's actually how those amazing things come together in a way that makes everything a little different from elsewhere. I'm going to talk a bit about the capacity to own a narrative, and then also entry points and scale. So what is the capacity for people to actually know the place the way you want them to know it? So starting with digital. So I did a project a few years ago looking at 250 cities around the world. Cape Town was one of them. And we were really trying to see whether the amount of traffic on social media and online news around a particular city had any material impact. And there was one really interesting finding, and that was that if you ranked cities by GDP and you ranked them by the number of mentions, it's basically the same list. And so we could say that the number of mentions a place gets has a material impact on its ability to attract investment, on its economic potential. It's hard to know which direction that is, but it's very clear people aren't talking about place and they're not generating content on place. It's unlikely to attract significant investment. So that's something to bear in mind. And throughout this talk, I'm going to use kind of the smart cities transition as a lens towards thinking about brand. Cities wanting to become smart is also an indication of wanting to identify themselves with a particular kind of story. And what we're seeing around the world is that the smart cities market is doubling every 2 to 3 years. So there's significant investment going into this as an idea, as a way of reinventing place. But it often fails. And some of the reasons it fails is just because it's too fuzzy. People aren't quite sure what it is that they're doing. There's a lack of clear objectives. Often the way cities and places procure creates all sorts of interesting challenges. Often there's an inability to connect with actually local communities as part of procurement. So there's digital divides. You're not that able to create content or connect with the digital infrastructure, closed architectures and vendor lock-ins, so no flexibility into the future, and kind of a sense that it's a game for grown-ups. So, maybe Cape Town city centre should invest in this, but, why is Bellville looking at this? So maybe looking at some of the data that the company that I work with has on European cities. So we have a network of about 300 European cities and across 800 projects. And what we see is, if we think about innovation, so where places are investing in across Europe, primarily it's going to energy, mobility, buildings, and communications, so infrastructure, ICT. So primarily physical. But if you think about this, it's perhaps much more about infrastructure than about people. So health, inclusion, safety, in some ways, not necessarily infrastructure, more about social. And so what we're seeing in Europe, and I would imagine actually some of the work is similar where you are, the focus when it comes to improving places primarily on infrastructure and not so much on the people who actually use that infrastructure. And then if we maybe try and figure out some stories behind all of these different categories, there may be 6 themes which come out a lot in Europe in terms of how places are needing to invest. And the one is around digitalization, data, and AI. So there's a lot more data on place, so we need AI to help us make sense through it and sift through it. There's the future of work, which is particularly relevant for more secondary nodes, as the focus moves away from having to be very close to the city center, which would be the case in Bellville, I imagine. We've got energy transition, security and decarbonization, smart mobility, ports and logistics. A big consequence of COVID is not so much just reorganizing how people move and when they move, but whether they need to move at all, which has a big impact on what places fall. We've got intelligent carbon neutral buildings. So buildings are having to take on more functions. And actually, there are many cases where cities are finding that their building stock is no longer fit for purpose, and significant parts of that is no longer lettable or livable. And then connected urban realm, decentralization and social value, which I think is something which is probably of particular interest in a place like Bellville, where actually it's not a centralized node. There's the sense that both from a technological point of view, a governance point of view, and also where people are living, places are kind of decentralizing. There's a sense of almost fragmentation of activity, which creates new opportunity for more localized places. And then behind all of this, there's a need for a place-based specialization of some kind. What is it that creates unique advantage for people in a particular space? And then if we think about what is a smart city or what is a city generally, you've got all these different things coming together, a range of different topics. But what we're seeing more and more is that it's not so much about specialization. So if you think, places have typically gotten a lot of brand value out of being an expert in one particular process or technology or knowledge, and increasingly places are getting brand from their ability to integrate. So the value is coming between the categories. And the reason that places are trying to do this is because they're realizing that by doing this, they can package either parts of the city or sectors in the city as being more able to do things than before. So let's say a smart industry or a smart district. And so in a place like Bellville, what is it that it can uniquely package it about itself? And a good reason to think about this is that any intervention in place can add value or destroy value. And often the reality is closer to the middle. And so being able to measure this becomes a key part of a brand success, and using that as part of the brand story. Some case studies just to think about. So many of you might not know about Sunderland, and that's part of the point. So Sunderland is in some ways like Bellville. It's a part of the UK that is not that well known. But a few years ago, it got into trouble in a sense for having of the worst broadband coverage in the country. And the city decided that it was going to use this as part of its narrative of reinvention. And it's very quickly, through some quite tactical investments, through some quite tactical storytelling, repositioned itself as the smart city, one of the UK's key smart cities. And the reason I mention this is because sometimes being behind can be part of a reinvention story for place, provided that investments and storytelling are used quite tactically together. And in some ways, Sunderland, what they're doing is not that unique from what some other cities in the UK are doing, but they've really managed to capture the narrative around being behind and catching up. Another example, another approach is Helsinki, which essentially they decided they wanted to be the world's most climate-friendly city in many ways. And what they've done is every single project that they engage with has to have some kind of a climate action. And so their approach to brand is very much being, how do we concentrate around one idea? How do we make sure that everything we're doing tells this particular story about place? So two slightly different approaches. And then if we think about how technology is landing on place and changing the experience of place, it's saying that things like smart bins is not just about being climate neutral. So by way of example, every new bin lorry in a city might add up to 1% of the municipality's emissions. So it's fairly substantial if you're wanting to move towards being net zero. But it's also making sure that people can experience place in a way that's slightly more comfortable. So the fewer bins or bin bags lying around, or some of the infrastructure is not quite so crowded in the case of a metro, and being able to know when it's busy and not, and when to take a train. So a lot of brand is also moving towards our experience of place and our ability to experience it on our own terms. And I'm just going to throw some ideas to you, just so that you've got a few reference points. So currently doing a project in a city called Dunfermline, which is north of Edinburgh. In some ways, the distance between Edinburgh and Dunfermline is perhaps quite similar between the center of Cape Town and Bellville. But there's very little built up space in between. So in that sense, it's slightly different. But if you look at the pictures on the left, that's the rail infrastructure that they're trying to position. And if you were to look at Google Maps, you wouldn't see any public transport infrastructure. You'd see no rail infrastructure. And so if you were wanting to visit this area, you would have no sense that it's connected, or that you can get there other than by driving. Whereas the image on the right is an image from Berlin, where they decided actually they were going to use their rail network to quite strategically tie the region together, to reunify East and West Berlin, to tell a very clear story of Berlin as one place, but also a clear story of being able to access Berlin. And so if I think about Bellville, what story would outsiders get of their ability to access Bellville if they didn't know it existed? So that's something to think about. And then a few weeks ago, I traveled to Barcelona. We've got an office in Barcelona. And I took out my route planner, and it showed me a very simple journey to get from the airport into the city center. And I was quite surprised halfway when I had to buy a second ticket to continue my journey. And so that sense of my trust was broken. From a digital point of view, I was told this is a very simple journey. But the city, from a physical point of view, didn't provide that experience. And so what we're finding with brand is also the physical and the digital colliding, and people's sense of trust being impacted by the expectation of how the city should work from what they've learned online. And we're also seeing that as there's more and more data available, people are also using data as a way of almost second guessing how they should experience place. So in this case, this is a graph of how a range of different indicators across Fife, which is the region where Dunfermline is in, and essentially the data is being used to argue why urban spaces don't perform as well as rural spaces. And so there is something interesting that as more and more data becomes available, it becomes part of a place's brand story and perception of place. What we're also seeing is that as a consequence of more and more data being collected on place, some cities, so in this case Amsterdam, is moving towards including transparency and consent within their brand. So in this case, every organization wanting to collect information or data from people in public space, they need to register it. And if they don't, they get a fine. So this creates another way of the city, in a sense, presenting itself as a place that you can trust. But as you start adding more and more technologies onto place, you get informalization of space. So I know that you don't have e-scooters in Cape Town, but at least not as part of a shared fleet. But across Europe, there are many, many shared fleets of e-scooters that are around. And quite recently, Paris decided that it was going to ban these fleets because they were just too messy on public streets. They were on the pavements, they were in the way, they were causing all sorts of issues for people. At least that was the reason for Paris deciding to ban them. And one of the consequences of new technologies and new ways of living in cities is that there is a good chance that space will become less formal. And that obviously has a particular relevance in South Africa, where there is already a tension between formalized and informalized space playing out in slightly different ways. And linked to this is a project I did a few years ago for a developer in London, where they were trying to see, well, what happens if buildings stop being just residential or just commercial, or and this idea of actually over time buildings are becoming much more mixed use, much more flexible use, and there's much more ambiguity. And that also has an impact on brand, because there's the question mark of, if buildings start to blur in their use case in what they're for, what happens when that expands across a whole piece of a city. And from a brand point of view, there's also not just a new kind of architecture, but also a new kind of architect or expert, where increasingly people who are not experts are wanted to participate quite positively in how the city behaves. A lot more co-design efforts, a lot more sense of ownership of space, and that also has an impact on brand. And maybe as a last kind of thought around this idea is, if we think about gentrification, the story is that artists or communities will often move into a distressed community. They'll beautify it or show the value, make it much more visible, and then there'll be real estate speculation, which will then drive up prices and sometimes squeeze the people who started everything out. One of the ideas around technology is that if you move over to things like NFTs, is that or other kinds of web-based technologies, maybe the people who, let's say, do some of this artwork can maintain some kind of ownership over that, so that as asset values increase, actually they continue to benefit from it into the future. So it's a lot of interesting things happening around brand in cities. And then as cities are going on this journey of brand, there's a big question around inclusion and collaboration, that actually, if we want innovation in places, we've really got to be thinking about how do we collaborate more effectively? How do we ensure that different ideas are meaningfully able to interact with the space? I'll go over this quite quickly. In a sense, cities are realizing, as part of their brand, they were really wanting to collaborate and co-create a lot more. So a lot of efforts to bring in data from citizens, so whether that's climate data or data on how space operates. And then as a final case study, just because it's regional, this is a case study that it was a project across the whole of Belfast region, and trying to cluster to figure out how it all fits together as a story of a whole. And so perhaps there's a question mark as to what is Bellville's particular story within a wider regional story. And in a sense, can Bellville play a pivotal role? So in this case, Belfast, out of 100 projects, ended up choosing just three projects which kickstarted everything. Could Bellville be one of those projects that kickstarts transformational change across a region like Cape Town? So maybe just as some, like your cheat sheet at the end of this, just some passing ideas as building blocks for a brand. Think about your priorities. What part of the city or region needs to become known or experienced differently, and why? Perhaps do an audit. What can you truly own as a unique story? And do your investments overlap with this? And would those without any knowledge agree with the story you're telling? And then from a data side, collect data that provides both a local and a global perspective, how easy it is to know your place. So always think about how somebody with no knowledge would either agree or disagree with your story. And then sometimes think about the network benefits of brand. So highlight how your project helps other parts of the city to reach its ambition, because it's much more likely that it'll be amplified. If it's not just a project that generates local benefits. And so as a passing thought, I wanted to see what I could know about Tygerberg. This is one of the first sites that come up. There's very little that as an outsider I can get to know about Tygerberg. There's a question mark, could that be improved? And if I think about images as a kind of data, and I do a search on Tygerberg, which I just chose because of the Tygerberg partnership. Actually, as somebody maybe who's an outsider, it's quite hard to really get a texture of, what is this that's trying to be built? So perhaps a piece of infrastructure that could be looked at. Yeah, and then again, I said I'd come back to this picture right at the end. This is one of the highest quality images I could find on Tygerberg. And so, the question, is it an urban space? Is it a place where I can work? Is it a place where I can invest in? Is it a place where I can live in? All those questions people are likely to ask around brand, and that'll drive their perception of what a place can be about. So thank you so much.
Peter, thank you very, very much. Yeah, some interesting imagery around Tygerberg and potentially Bellville, but I think the point you make is that actually applies to a lot of cities around the world who are looking to recreate their identity and rebrand themselves. See, we have some delegates or some participants here from other African cities. There's somebody from Lagos, and equal application to those cities, to your references to the city we're talking about, whether it be Bellville, Tygerberg, Johannesburg, Lagos, etc. So I think the principles apply. I know you and I had an interesting conversation around smart cities and what makes a smart city, and tech obviously plays a big role. I'm quite passionate about a smart city being somewhere where citizens engage in public spaces. So the more people you see in the public spaces, for me, equates to a smarter city. But as we're going through the Internet of Things and a whole lot of change in how we see the world with AI and everything else, data is becoming more and more relevant to everything we do within a city. How citizens are moving around their space, how they're seeing it, why they're there, and how they're producing either economic value or changing things and living in a space. So I think there's a combination of two, the tech and the human element, but I think the human element really does start dictating that emotional creation of an identity for whichever city in the world we're talking about. And I think the citizens play a huge role in guiding that identity. I'd made some notes during a talk, and you talked about certain key words when you were in Barcelona, but emotional bond of the citizens, getting people involved and emotionally vested in their city, really, really important. Self-confidence. You mentioned self-confidence when you're traveling. You don't want to lose confidence being in an environment, and creating existing infrastructure, bringing new infrastructure, and then encouraging visitors, be they tourists, be they residents, etc., encouraging that. So those are all really, really important. Cities have evolved. I think it was Cedric Price who compared cities to eggs. I think the ancient cities were hard-boiled eggs within walls, and that was a city. They then became fried eggs, and we had urban sprawl. We had a city center, and everyone was living outside of it. And it's now become an omelette where it's a mix of everything, and the city's really become diverse and busy. Public space and public realm is something really, really important. And how do we activate public realms? Tanya is going to talk to us about some of her projects, some of her experience, and specifically one project she's busy working on. But how do we activate the public realm? Is there a public realm strategy? What do we do? And how does the city go about identifying its key assets and its key USPs in defining its public realm? So Tanya, I'm going to hand over to you. Thank you for being here, and we're looking forward to hearing.
Thanks, Warren. It was a very good summary of what Peter was saying, and I think how people engage with the city is where my topic starts. So I'm going to start sharing my slides quickly. So the topic that I'm talking about today is urban placemaking as a tool for shaping city identity. And I think the first question is, what is urban placemaking? And I mean, there are various different elaborate explanations, but in a nutshell, for me, it's really about improving the public spaces within a city through design and various other ways so that people feel that they want to be in the space and that they are comfortable being in the space, whether it's comfortable sitting on a chair or sitting on a seat or having shade and greenery. It's what makes people want to come to your city and to use the spaces within the city. And more importantly, placemaking has the ability to change people's perception of their city. So therefore, for me, there are 4 key principles in what makes a good placemaking. Firstly, first and foremost, it's about the people. How people use the space, how they move through the space, how people relate to the scale of the space, how tall are the buildings, what's in the buildings, is it an active space? Again, the shading, greenery, what type of activities happen in the space plays a key part in the experience of that space. Second point is mixed-use developments. Diversity is a huge part of what makes a city a city. And having a range of different functions in a space helps activate that space throughout time of the day. So if you're combining residential with commercial, with retail, you can activate that space for 24 hours, and there's always people moving through that space. Thirdly, it's about active and inclusive public spaces. I think far too often in cities, and especially back in the day, you get these public spaces that are actually quite vast and lacks personality in a sense. They might be an old sculpture, but other than that, you actually feel awkward in that space, and you actually just want to move through and get out of it. And it's about how do you create a space that makes people feel like they belong there, like they want to spend time there. And then the fourth one is creating a sense of identity and history. And that's really about honing in on what's the culture of the city, what is the history, what's the historic architectural character, and how does this make this part of the city unique? And then the question becomes, so those are all great strategies or principles to take into account when designing a space, but how do you then go about implementing this? And that's basically through public realm strategies. And there are 5 key strategies that we look at from the work that I do. And the first is looking at pedestrianization. So whether it's completely car-free zones or trying to create more pedestrian-friendly zones, so shared streets, to encourage people to walk and use the cityscape. The second one is to look at green spaces, incorporating more green spaces into a city, and squares that are functional, so the right scale has got the right mix of uses surrounding it. That creates relief within the density of a city. And it's all about balance. So balancing the kind of hustle and bustle of city life and people with spaces that you can go and relax on a bench under a tree. And you need both of those things in a city. Then the third one is looking at streetscape improvements. So enhancing sidewalks, quality lighting so that people feel safe, street furniture that's functional, and that creates a certain atmosphere and identity. The fourth one is looking at public art and installations. And this is almost ties into starting to brand the city, and how do you create a kind of identity for the city that ties into cultural elements and events. And then the fifth one, which I think is quite a useful tool, is tactical urbanism. And basically what that means is it's an easy, low-cost way of testing ideas. So before you go through the route of final implementation, you do some paint or movable furniture that is not there to last forever, but it immediately tests your idea. You can get community feedback as to, is what you're trying to implement usable for the people you are trying to do it for? And then what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about a case study. So we're doing work for Greater Tygerberg Partnerships in Bellville, and looking at public realm strategies for Bellville CBD. And I'm going to take you through a little journey of walking through the city and tell you about the ideas we're exploring. So firstly, to give you a little bit of an overview of what is Bellville. And I think this is the question everyone asks about every city, and for me, Bellville is synonymous with diversity. There's something of everything in Bellville, and it's got a certain energy and grittiness and excitement in the city. So taking this into account, I'm going to start at the southern end of Bellville CBD, which is where the train station is. And it's South Street, under the Tiny Mayor overpass. And some of the ideas, the left-hand side picture shows you the current condition of the space. And it's one of the highest foot traffic areas in Bellville because of the proximity between the bus station and the train station. Yet it's not a great space to move in, and it feels rather unsafe the later in the day you go. And the kind of initiatives that we're trying to explore is basically what I've done is set them into three categories. Streetscape improvements. So looking at lighting. Lighting is hugely important in creating a perception of safety and just general upliftment of a space. Then looking at materiality. So we're exploring the idea of creating a shared surface, a space that feels like it belongs to the people more than cars. And then the idea of incorporating events, activities to activate the space, whether it's closing part of it for parts of the day or closing it for events at certain times of the year, and incorporating temporary structures in an effort to activate the space specifically on the two ends. And then we're also looking at how do you liven up the space through art. So I know through experience, we've now realized that painting the underside of bridges is complicated, but I'm still pushing for it and hoping one day they'll get it right. But art plays a vital part in communicating culture and how people see their own city. And it's a great way of livening up the space. Then moving up from South Street, Bristol Avenue is an interesting street, and a lot of work and good work has been done to pedestrianize Bristol. And we believe building on that is a great way of kind of using I want to say, if you have one pot of paint, then you make sure you use it in one area instead of dispersing it and having little blobs. So here we're looking at using what's already been done and amplifying it. So incorporating maybe some very nice street lighting, creating a theme, kind of special center. It's right in the center of the city. So also adding more landscaping to the street, further pedestrianizing the street in the future, or at least being able to close off the whole of Busschau for events, whether it's markets on certain times of the weekend or festivals annually, but the ability to close off that whole center strip from vehicles. And then again, the notion of art installations, whether it's painting the streets to give the perception that this is a zone for more pedestrianized activity and cars come secondary, whether it's about creating identity through art and sculpture in a space. Then Elizabeth Park. So some of the things we looked at here is accessibility, first off. How do you access the park? How does the park announce itself? It's a beautiful space, but it's underutilized. And teasing out why spaces are underutilized is also what we focus on. So what would make a person want to be in the space? And whether it's, again, the notion of adding lighting, strategic lighting, which can be in the form of art. It's about activities, creating activities and events in a park to bring people in, whether it's walkways, cycling routes, music festivals, and then again, arts and installations, whether those are temporary structures or whether they're permanent investments within the space. Parking lots. Parking in cities is always a problem. And how you deal with cars in a dense environment. So one of the notions we're exploring is, do you start kind of consolidating parking into parking structures so that you free up valuable land in the city that can be used for other functions? And here it becomes a balance between kind of a commercially driven development versus using it for public use. And I think that's always a kind of balance. How do you strike that balance? But what we were looking at is temporary uses for those spaces. So converting it into market spaces, doing food gardens, using it for sports and activities, using art to activate the space temporarily. And what does that, how would that change the perception of the surrounding neighborhood? Then the interesting thing about Bellville that I didn't know before starting this work is that it's actually made up of a series of lanes and arcades that you discover when walking through there. It's not immediately obvious, and it's actually quite special and unique to Bellville. And it's about looking at these spaces and the finer grained grid and seeing how can you celebrate those. And there are many examples across the world of how that's been done successfully through streetscape improvements, whether it's lighting, having, again, the notion of art as a kind of gateway announcement that this is where the lane starts. Using different forms of activity, market stalls, allowing various temporary uses in those spaces. And then the last one is transport hubs. So Bellville is a major transport hub and transport interchange between buses, taxis, the train lines, and it's a huge opportunity. There's the Bellville bus stop has a very unique character to it, and it's about how can you make more of that space. So the things we were looking at here is, do you start creating wider sidewalks, create more space for people, because it's a very heavily foot trafficked area. So how do you celebrate and exploit that? providing bigger spaces for markets, creating markets within that structure and expanding it. How do you incorporate art? This is your kind of gateway into the city for many people. And how do you start creating a language that announces that you've arrived in Bellville? And there are a few examples on the slide of how it's been done in other areas through art and lighting and activating the space. And then I thought I'd leave you with 3 kind of key impacts and benefits. So of doing public realm upgrades. And the first is it improves the quality of life. It's what makes people want to move to your city. Secondly, it obviously facilitates economic growth. So what makes people want to visit your city? Why do people want to go to a certain, why do people want to go to New York? Why do people want to go to Paris? It's about the spaces and what they mean to people. And then the last one is health and well-being. So what makes people ultimately want to live in your city and stay there and grow old there? And that's it for me.
Tanya, thank you very, very, very much. I love the imagery. I love the thought that's gone into a lot of your work. I know you guys have spent a lot of time in the space to try and understand it. And I think that's a critical message for every city. I think when you're looking at trying to create a branding exercise around your space or your city, that understanding the fabric that exists currently is so important before you embark on putting something down. I think what I heard you talking about was the diversity, the culture, the history that drives the direction of your design and some of the initiatives that you're talking about. Stickiness for me is a major thing. And I think every city in the world will talk about stickiness and how you get people to linger longer in a space, be it in a public space or an economic activity, because that drives activity all the way through the city. So I think, thank you very much for your presentation and the thought-provoking images you put out there. I see color plays a massive role in where we can change a city's brand, and branding goes way beyond just physical things. There's a lot of emotional ties, and I'm going to go through some of the questions that were posted, and actually both, ironically, very linked. From Shamani, he asked, how do we ensure that we protect our public furniture? And I think it goes beyond just furniture. How do we protect installations, art, furniture, changes that you're making in a space? And before I let Tanya have a chance to answer that, our experience, particularly around art, is that the citizens have taken a level of ownership, and in fact, it's not even very few. None of our art installations have been sabotaged or changed or ruined by the public. There is almost a sense of pride around the installation of artwork, be they murals in paint or physical artworks. So a sense of pride amongst the citizenship is really, really important. And that led straight into Nompilo's question. How do you incorporate the community of Bellville or any city in developing some of these concepts so we can take some sort of ownership and responsibility? So Tanya, how do we get the citizens to take that ownership and responsibility?
So I think it comes down to communication and involving the citizens in the whole design of the space. Because ultimately there's always this contradiction between the designer's perceived identity, or what they perceive the identity of Bellville, and what the people who actually live there, what their real experience of that, what they believe the identity is. And it's oftentimes there could be a mismatch. And then you find this scenario where you don't necessarily have ownership of it, and because it's missing the point. And I think the way around that is to involve the community in the process of establishing what the identity is, through establishing what initiatives you want to implement and getting feedback. And I think, whether it's through a process of tactical urbanism or tactical testing of the various initiatives could be one platform of getting that feedback.
Perfect. In fact, again, another question leads straight into that from Mariga. How do we create sustainability and who facilitates the process? The stakeholders are normally quite vast in terms of a rebranding, a repositioning, and identity creation of a city. And in fact, we've got a poll which is going to come after Alex's presentation around who is responsible for taking on that change in identity or change in branding. You know, is it the municipal government? Do they play a big role in driving it? Or is it the citizens' responsibility to change it themselves? Or are there private consultants and professionals who can get involved in driving these things? So we're going to put that question to you guys, in fact, as to where you believe that role should be sitting. Perhaps it's a combination of all three, but it'll be interesting to see what people think as to who's responsible for that. And then how do we create a sustainability that's so important in a long-lasting rebranding exercise? I think changing a brand in the short term is of no good to anybody. So it really needs to be sustainable. Tanya, thank you so much. Don't go anywhere. There are a lot of questions that we're going to be asking a bit later, and we're keen to hear your opinions.
Thanks.
Alex, your turn. I know certainly not by any means least. I know you are last in the presentations, but your voice of reason and your experience in the public space is really, really important and very valuable. And we've taken a very global view with Peter. We've looked at a slightly more narrowed view from professionals in looking at public space and understanding the texture of an area. From Tanya, we're now going to look at even a slightly more microcosmic project that you've been working on together with the City of Cape Town in tackling a short-term initiative and what impact that could potentially have. So Alex, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thanks, Warren. Okay, let me just share my screen quickly. So the BABLE Together campaign, which I'm going to abbreviate to BBT so that I don't trip over it. But this is a great and very practical application of placemaking, which is changing public perception of Bellville, particularly the Bellville CBD. The BBT campaign is a City of Cape Town placemaking initiative that is being implemented by the Greater Tygerberg Partnership. And the purpose of the campaign is to support and reinforce current services with the ability to fill gaps, try new things, and work within faster timeframes, with a focus on improving public spaces. When we've been asking people what they think of Bellville, it's unfortunately fairly negative description words: dirty, dangerous, grey, broken, messy, etc. And so the campaign is really trying to move that perception of Bellville towards becoming a place that is described as clean, green, inspiring, neat, colourful, playful, safe, etc. It speaks to people wanting to dwell in the space, come to Bellville and stay rather than just move through. And the end goal is to support investment confidence and the growth of the Bellville economy. Better Bellville Together. So it's a live project. We're busy working on it. Phase 1 has been active since February and is coming to a close next week at the end of June. So we had 1 month of planning and 4 months of implementation to make a big enough impact to unlock a phase 2. It's then also trying to achieve a broader opportunity where this model, if successful, can potentially be rolled out to other areas, have a better Goodwood together, have a better Paro, etc. So with that, phase 1, we really had to narrow our focus to ensure that we could really have an impact in strategic activation nodes and choosing those areas based on a needs basis, as well as choosing important gateways into Bellville and important areas along main arterial routes, really to have that visual impact. We focused on 5 areas to start shifting the needle on public perception. And it does touch a little bit on the key strategies that Tanya unpacked earlier. So the 5 areas that we thought we could have a big enough impact in the short space of time was 1, developing a campaign awareness and branding. The second was waste to resource. 3rd, infrastructure. graffiti and illegal poster removal, and then beautification, and beautification including murals and gardens. So the communication team created a simple but bold brand for Better Bellville Together in 3 languages with a nice color palette that we could use strategically as we needed. And then they developed these kind of marketing tools to support us in implementation, such as the t-shirt, which actually became a really, really powerful tool for all of us as the activation team. We've basically been on the streets of Bellville for 4 months, making these positive changes and having that visibility in the blue t-shirt and that link between fixing, cleaning, etc., has really been a success story. The waste to resource team, so they spent a lot of time understanding the existing with City. The systems, there are a lot of systems in place, and so it was not to reinvent the wheel, but to identify the gaps of where we could play the biggest impact around waste and cleaning. And the biggest gaps was separation at source and education around that, and then developing an organics collection system. And so the separation at source was focused at the public transport interchange, just from a importance and impact point of view. Obviously, you have tens of thousands of people moving through that space. It's also it makes a lot of waste. And so they set up or designed a new bin system and then developed the system of collection around that. And then they have a team of waste educators every day at the PTI engaging with the public so that there's a understanding about why it's important to separate at source. And then they've been developing this organics collection system, which reaches beyond just the PTI, where there's a visible team walking around with their green big trolley collecting organics that have been collected at different businesses throughout the CBD area. We have 25 businesses on board. And then that organic waste goes to the Mayfair space, which is in walking distance. And we now have this amazing steaming pile of compost. And moving forward, we would love to develop a more circular economy where that compost is going into our gardens. There's also kind of social entrepreneurial opportunities for selling compost, etc. Then this just speaks to the visibility and having that team, the waste educators on site every day. There's also an art team that's there twice a week that's physically making art from waste. And then that's getting installed in these public art installations that are busy growing as we speak at the PTI and really transforming the public transport interchange from a very gray area and bringing it to life through art made from waste. Moving on to infrastructure, there's been a team of 5 people, 3 of which are highly skilled retirees. They're retired city roads maintenance officials, so highly skilled, leading this team in fixing broken stuff. So fixing the public spaces, working outside of the roadways, so fixing potholes in pavements, reinstating paving, fixing downpipes, piping, bollards, benches, etc. And they have been really, again, like the waste educators and the graffiti team, they are frontline workers, if we're going to call them that. They're on the street every day in their blue t-shirts, making a positive, visible change. They're changing the perception of the streets being broken and messy and moving it to fixed and neat. And they, in the last 4 months, have fixed around 150 breaks, which is really impressive. Then the graffiti and illegal poster removal team, same thing. They're out there every day removing these illegal stickers, this really problematic messaging that is put up around the Bellville CBD, removing and repainting over tags, a lot of which are, criminal elements. And they're going consistently every day, and it's showing this is not acceptable. We're not standing for this, and we're going to be keeping Bellville clean in this respect. It is very reactionary, and again, moving into phase 2, we would like to be including prevention. So how can we reduce this kind of illegal activity happening in the first place? Oh, and they have removed about 3,000 illegal stickers and posters. Moving on to beautification. So from a gardens point of view, gardens really have an incredible high impact in spaces and transforming spaces from a, pebble pit or a piece of gravel into a well-designed, inspiring, green, lively design and space. We've managed to, over the last 4 months, introduce 3 new large gardens and then 5 smaller gardens throughout the CBD. When we started, the kind of go-to response when we talked about bringing gardens into Bellville was that the plants are going to get stolen. Plants have been stolen. We've lost about between 10 and 20 plants have been stolen, but we've introduced over 2,000 plants. So the hit rate is pretty good right now. And obviously there's the ongoing maintenance that we are developing and ensuring moving forward. And anecdotally, just to include here a response to one of the photos of the gardens that was put on social media from Tara, which was such amazing work. I think I'll go shopping in Bellville again soon. Big steps are being taken to clean this area up. That's exactly what we're trying to achieve, and it's showing impact. Obviously, it's very localized, but it proves that there's impact and that using gardens to transform urban gritty spaces is possible. Then murals. We worked with Baz Art to bring in more murals and public art into the Bellville CBD. There is already a lot of public art in the CBD, and so it's really to build on that and really work towards creating a public art destination of the Bellville CBD. For this campaign, we wanted to try and have a common language between the murals, and so we worked with Baz Art and in creating a Bellville creative identity. And this is what you're seeing on screen now, and it's really about the people, the diversity of people that really brings Bellville to life. It's playful, it's colorful, it's endearing, it's simple, and we're really happy with this outcome. And then this creative identity has then been pulled into different murals and then kind of localized. And so examples here, and Tanya, it speaks to the desperate need of the PTI to have had a kind of a more of a announcement that you're coming to this incredible large transport interchange. And so now there's the new mural on the round PTI building, which says Bellville, and you can see that bright red Bellville from Futurist Road. So that's brilliant. And then it has the characters that are kind of relevant to that area. It includes the trader, the ruster next door, the parking attendant, the policewoman, the bus, the taxi, etc. So it's really transformed the space, high impact. And on the right-hand side is the another mural from the BBT campaign, which is on the corner of Futurist and Boston Street, which is then speaking to kind of the activities in that area. So you've got a butcher, you've got a shopper, you've got a trader, etc. The rain has delayed us, so we were hoping to have 6 new murals up in the space of 4 months. Those are still coming online, the other 3. But I think these have really proven the point about the use of public art to automatically transform a space and the public's perception around that space. So in closing, I think it's a very fast snapshot of what we've achieved, very localized impact, but impact in any case. And it's kind of 90% sure that the impact of phase 1 has been good enough to unlock that phase 2. And we're also in a really great space now from a momentum point of view, where it's very difficult to get public engagement and stakeholder engagement right in 4 months. But we have business owners behind us, we have property owners behind us, supporting the campaign in different ways, whether it's repainting their building facade or accepting, allowing us to paint a mural, or signing up for the organics collection. But then we also have a great space that we're in now with how we're working with the city officials, and where we have city officials who are going, oh, we had a recycling pilot that's now coming to an end at the end of June, and we don't know where to, if and how we can continue it. Is this something that the BBT campaign can include? Yes, it can. We then on site at the Bellville Civic Centre with a group of city officials busy brainstorming how can we bring a new and innovative lighting to the Bellville Civic Centre as a demonstration site for new lighting that can then be rolled out throughout the CBD. And I think that that has also really proven that the impact of this campaign. And I'm hoping that's provided tangible examples of placemaking in Bellville and shifting the needle a little bit with public perception. And I think there are people from Bellville in this session, and it's really an invitation to have a conversation with you about how we can make your Bellville better. And so I hope our contact details are circulated to the attendees afterwards so that we can really, draw people in. Thank you.
Alex, thank you very, very, very much. That obviously this project is very close to my heart. I think the work and the professionalism that's been embarked on from a very flexible and flying start has been impressive. I think the fact that we've unlocked the phase 2 is fantastic, presents more opportunities. Leading on some of the questions that we've been asked in the group, Daniel's talked about the utilization of best practice, and absolutely, Daniel, it's difficult in the South African context to always apply best practice. European best practice doesn't necessarily fit exceptionally well within the local context. However, where we get best practice meeting local environment and local community, we're seeing a massive impact. So how do we modify and utilize best practice from an international perspective and bring that into a local community is the fruits of the labor that Alex is talking about, and how we're seeing that. Shamani, you asked a question around painting bridges and public participation. Again, it's not so much public participation, it's more community involvement. And we've got hard and fast cases in this micro project of the community, building owners, property owners, informal traders on the streets, residents, commuters getting involved in the project and committing themselves to uplifting the area. And that buy-in and that commitment creates longevity and sustainability. So I do think it's really, really important. I know we've got, and Alex, you touched on it, people from the area looking to get involved. Vessel Stratum, thank you very much for your offer. We will certainly be contacting you and posting opportunities to get involved. It's really, really exciting. We're getting more and more momentum around this specific project. And keep in mind, this is applicable to any city around the world. This has really just taken some of the ideas that Peter talked about, Tanya put into very eloquent words, and these are practical implementations of those same concepts in starting a rebranding or identity creation for an area. With the end of the presentations, we have opportunities for questions, we have opportunities for engagement. I'm going to ask my fellow panelists to all come back on screen. I'm going to put a few questions to them, both from the question box plus one or two others that I've picked up along the way. Daniel, it's probably apt to do the survey now. I think we had a survey, and I mentioned it earlier. Whose responsibility is it to drive this branding and identity of a city space? Is it the municipal government? Is it the citizens themselves, external stakeholders being professionals, consultants, etc., or is it all of the above? Whose responsibility is undertaking this city brand identity challenge? If you can put your responses in there, I'm going to carry on talking while you respond. We've had two questions revolving around students and the involvement of the students. We're very blessed in this area, and again, I apologize if I'm referring specifically to the area we work in, Bellville, but we're very blessed with three major higher tertiary institutions, and we do involve the students. In fact, we're very involved with the institutions themselves. So we engage with both their departmental heads on strategies around composting, environmental affairs, technical and engineering services. So we do try and engage with our communities in finding viable solutions. It does take a lot of hard work and a lot of effort to get everybody to buy in, specifically if there are changing stakeholders, but slowly but surely, hopefully in 5, 10, 15, 20 years time, we'll start seeing the effect of that stakeholder engagement. Pride of place and citizen pride is really, really important. So overwhelmingly, all of the above. And I think, Alex, that points to your final comment that you made in your presentation, your engagement with the city, your engagement with the local NGOs, your engagement with the citizens and external stakeholders is really the answer going forward. So thank you guys for that response. I do have some general questions, and I'm not going to be overly specific. So if anybody likes to raise them. I see somebody referenced Washington and the bridge project, the Bridge Park project. Interesting enough, I was also privileged to be in Washington and have a look at another area in Washington, which was the focus of a very specific campaign to change an area. Adam Morgan is a little suburb in Washington, which was derelict and had become, for those of you who know Johannesburg, the old Melville. It had lost its identity, and they embarked on a very specific campaign to reinvent Adam Morgan together with its citizens. And it's become the most lively, flourishing restaurant, bar, young vibe in a structured manner. So it was a very intentional rebranding of a suburb within Washington and highly successful. So for those of you who saw the link to Bridge Park in the thing, go and have a look at Adam Morgan, similar storyline. Peter, what is the relationship between a city's image and the quality of life within the city?
It's a difficult question, Warren, but I would say that maybe tying that to the poll that you've just done, that everybody has a stake in telling whether a place works or not. And so if you've got a general sense that a place is livable, you're probably going to end up with an image that shows that in some way or other. So I would say that even though they maybe not directly linked, actually over time, the result of saying that a place is livable will come out in some sense of perception. And I think maybe that there's something quite interesting in perception. Maybe if we take a step back on. And so one of the data points that I thought was really interesting is when I did the global look at cities, is that Lagos and London have exactly the same sentiment score. So if you take all of the messages, everything happening, London and Lagos get exactly the same. It's pretty much 65%, so it's slightly positive. And I think it's really worth remembering that a person's perception of how a place performs is a very local measure. Like it's a very local sense. And so in some ways there is that link, but a lot of it has to come to just a sense of how people feel about the place that they live in.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think it wasn't a couch question. I think the quality of life question does relate very specifically to the space you're talking about. And in your reference, Lagos and London, quality of life involves a whole lot of metrics. Cost and affordability be one, where I'm sure Lagos would outperform London, and there'd be different metrics which would indicate and influence that quality of life. But I think quality of life for the citizens, again, buys commitment, buys loyalty, buys support and infrastructure. So it is something we need to consider. Tanya, in your experience as an architect, and there's some architects have played a massive role in city evolvement and city design over centuries. Does a city need an iconic development, an iconic reference point? City of Cape Town might have Table Mountain, but does a city need an iconic reference point?
Yeah. The urban designer in me says no. I don't know. It's a subjective. My opinion is that it's about authenticity. I think, you know, identity and what a city is more about what its history is, what I mean, I guess iconic building comes into what's the vision for the city, and do you want to portray it as something different than what it is currently? And then, yes, some kind of signature development or rebranding, using that as a rebranding tool, then yes, Beckham plays a part. But I don't think it is a requirement in order to have a great city that you have to have some kind of iconic architecture.
Perfect, thanks. Peter, your thoughts?
So I mean, a lot of cities have used the idea of, you know, an iconic piece of architecture as an attraction and a key attraction and a key reinvention kind of tool. But I think what's much more important are entry points, you know, and actually a star attraction is just an entry point. You're just concentrating everything in one place. So for me, what would be much more important is, let's assume I was landing in Cape Town, what would point me towards Bellville? What would make it easy for me to think that's a place I should visit? And if I think a place I should visit, that I can actually get there, that it's accessible in some way. So I would say some of that infrastructure is digital. It's not necessarily even physical. So kind of that sense of access to place is probably much more important than how a place is arranged. Although, yeah, using big shiny things can help.
Cool, thank you. And in fact, in many cities around the world, it's not even a built structure, it's a natural structure. So I think leveraging off what you have around you, I think I'm glad you mentioned accessibility, because I'm going to punt Bellville. We're the most accessible and affordable built environment in the country. So just for reference point, accessibility is really, really important. There are a couple of questions, and Alex, I'm going to try and bring you in here. Kaniso asked around maintenance for projects, urban projects, space and public realm projects. Talk to us about how that gets done.
Well, maintenance is key, really. So in this example, it's collaborative. So we've been able to do the implementation, and now we're putting in place the team that's going to be maintaining. So the gardens in particular, there's going to be a kind of collaboration with the VRC. So we're setting them up with the right tools for watering and maintaining. And then we're also going to be bringing on and training a individual. So we have been creating employment and sheltered employment, particularly for people who are making their way out of homelessness. And so working with someone and upskilling them to be a garden keeper, the custodian of that garden. So that's what we are building and we're putting in place now, and that will tie the gardens over moving into phase 2. We're also then going to be looking at, you know, adopt a garden, also the custodianship and the ownership of the gardens to extend to the neighbors. So the Best Drive shop that's next door to one, UWC and Mr. Price, who are close to the others. It's really, bringing in that collective ownership.
Yeah,
I
think that's really important. I think that custodianship is, again, links back to the system ownership, and custodianship is a key to maintaining that. So I hope that answers that question. Tanya, question for you around the involvement of landscape architecture in heritage and cultural identity structures. How important are they?
I think it's vitally important. Landscaping has such a huge impact in how one experiences a city, and getting it right it's hugely important. It's about understanding that a seat is not going to work if it's in the wrong place or uncomfortable or not usable. So I think that's where landscape architects have a unique experience and can add a huge amount of value in creating the right type of environment to facilitate everything we've been talking about.
Cool, thank you, and I agree. I do concur. Again, Peter, a question for you around, we talked about the sentiment of a city. How do we measure that? What are the institutional metrics for measuring sentiment about a place?
I mean, there's some technical tools that'll do it for you using AI. So some social listening tools. So that's one way of doing it. You will get a little bit unstuck as soon as you start moving away from major languages. So that's definitely something to think about in South Africa. You could probably do English and Afrikaans at a fair level of certainty. Moving on to some of the other South African languages, you're going to struggle. And that's, to give you an idea, actually, Arabic, for example, is a particularly challenging language to do sentiment analysis on. Not because of the language itself, but just because the tools aren't as developed. So that's something to think about. But I would almost caution against focusing on sentiment, because again, it's a very localized sense of, is this place for me? Can I contribute to it? And linking to what Alex and Tanya are saying, you know, if you concentrate, like maybe back to the question of, do you need a very shiny building, that may limit the opportunity for people to contribute. Whereas if you've got that almost disaggregated and fragmented across the space, you've got lots more opportunity for contributing. So I would almost focus much more towards, rather than trying to measure sentiment, measure people's capacity to contribute and to be part of telling a place's story. It's probably more meaningful.
Okay, there's a challenge in that off the bat. Thanks. Thank you, Peter. One last question in the question box. I know it was aimed at Alex. I'm quite happy to answer it as well, but I will get Alex's viewpoint. You know, how were the public involved in some of the decisions, and what implementation was prioritized in terms of the sort of tactical urbanism that was implemented in such a short time? In fairness, it was a fairly narrow band around consultation, and because of the lead time, it was fairly short, and engagement was certainly rapid. And I think as we've gone through the 3, 4, 5 month process, more and more public participation has taken place, Alex, if that's fair to say, to reinforce some of the initiatives. I think the first couple of initiatives we were feeding our way through, but quite quickly we saw the momentum shifting in those directions. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, 100%. And also, I mean, to be fair, we were building this plane while flying it, because we had to prove impact over such a short space of time. And so a lot of the engagement was actually with people on the streets. So we've spent 4 months walking the CBD, implementing, engaging with property owners, business owners, and people who live and work and move through the space. And so a lot of the engagement has been quite informal in that regard, but also that granular detail is coming through there. In terms of where we chose to focus, it was, again, focusing on those kind of strategic areas. And now it's really the opportunity to have far more engagement in building out the phase 2. And it's an exciting opportunity now. And I think your question also said how to get involved. So I think we need to drop in the.
I think Hillary has put the links in there.
Oh, perfect. Cool.
Thank you, Alan. I see you asking who's funding this partnership. Not enough people is the short answer. We work very closely with the City of Cape Town, so the municipality does play a role, albeit under guided project direction. There are very specific outputs that they require. Tanya will be very aware that, for example, the public realm strategy involves multiple departments within the city, and we can't go off at a tangent without involving city line departments. The city does provide some funding for that. We rely quite heavily on external and private funding as well. It's an appointment of professionals to do public work, and as an NGO, we do require funding sources from all over, but the city are one of our big partners. So the City of Cape Town do provide a lot of support. And in fairness, I think over the last couple of years, an accelerated support structure to what's happening in BABLE. So it's a two-way process. We don't receive instruction from the city, but we do provide upward feedback in terms of understanding the fabric and the requirements of what this specific city requires. And I think the same we saw in our poll, it involves multiple stakeholders in solving a city's identity. Branding is a very specific thing, and I know Peter's worked a lot on marketing campaigns around branding an environment, be it a suburb, a city, a node, and they're very specific tools and techniques, and I'm not going to get into all of those right now. The one question I have for all our participants is, how does the name of the city influence its brand? You know, if we said Old York, it wouldn't quite invoke the same as New York. How does the name of a city influence its brand? Peter, start with you.
So again, I'd bring it back to entry points. You know, so if you have a brand that's, or at least a city name that's unique, and you're more likely to find it. Maybe some examples. So Essen in Germany, which just means to eat, you know, or even Perth in Scotland, you tend to land on Perth in Australia. So if you have an entry point that's clear, that really helps. So and you know, it's from a very pragmatic point of view. But I kind of feel like over time, if you're thinking about Old York, so kind of your example, I suspect over time that if what's happening in the place is sufficient enough, in some ways the semantic meaning of the words will become less important. And so actually I think you might find that doesn't necessarily matter so much over time. What matters much more is that it's a name that people can identify with and they can find.
Perfect. Tanya, your turn to answer that.
It's a difficult one. I think for me, it comes down to your connection with the place. A name brings up a feeling about a place. And yes, that's probably more for people who know it than for people who don't. I think if you're unfamiliar with the place, then what Peter said is really accurate in terms of, you know, finding it. But I think where a name starts to play a role is how you identify with that name. What kind of emotional connection does it establish within people? So that's probably my 2 cents on the topic.
Alex, I'm gonna put you slightly on the spot. Does Bellville, the name Bellville, invoke any emotion?
Not really, if I'm honest.
Interesting.
The name doesn't invoke, no. But obviously I know the CBD well, so then the nature of Bellville comes up, but no, it doesn't.
So again, something for everyone to think about. Does the name of your city invoke an emotion? Is Johannesburg invoking something, or should Igoli be the name? What creates that emotion for the city you live in? There are one question, Alex, I'm going to refer this to you. The initiative around Bellville specifically, how has it impacted on the municipal land use rezoning bylaws or policies?
It hasn't impacted on, we've had to work within them.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. And I think the city have been very, very proactive around allowing use of public space, which I think is important. And that collaboration, again, is critical. The NMT framework, absolutely. The Greater Tygerberg Partnership work in multiple directions. This is not the only project we have on our books. NMT and cycling initiatives and the framework around that is a critical one for us, and we're working with a team of professionals around using our space as a testing ground for initiatives to make mobility and non-motorized transport and urban mobility a real priority. So cycling and non-motorized transport is a very key component, and getting people and our citizens around the urban space. So that does play a huge role, absolutely. Last question. We're going to wrap up I have one more question. There's nothing else on the group. I have one question, and I'm going to start with the ladies. Peter, this time we'll end with you. The question is, do cities need to differentiate itself from other cities? Does Cape Town, does Lagos, does anywhere need to differentiate itself from another city, or does it need its own identity? Can you have overlapping identities? Tanya?
I think most cities have got some form of overlapping with each other. I think it's inevitable. I think there are certain, I think, again, I go on about the authenticity, but there are some inherent authentic parts of a city that can create that can facilitate its identity, and that creates a reason why people want to go visit a certain place. Whether that is a natural feature like Table Mountain or something, or whether it's the diversity of the population that exists in that city, it's a draw card which makes people want to go there.
So
yeah.
You don't have to be Milan to be a fashion center.
No, no.
Alex, your opinion.
Can you repeat the question?
Do cities need to differentiate themselves from other cities in creating their own identity?
I think if they're competing for a particular market, yes. But I think I think it's very hard for any city to be the same as another city. No city has a mono identity. Every city has this tapestry of identities making a whole. Yeah, that's my short.
Okay, cool.
Short
Peter,
answer.
your turn.
So I think we should probably start with what is it that makes a city unique, and it concentrates connection. And so in some ways, every city is about that. Like there's no way of getting away from that similarity across, I mean, depending on which data set you use, 3,000 or 4,000 cities around the world. But I think the question is much more, I would almost take the question a bit further, like what is the consequence of a unique identity on the ability to enjoy place? And so the example I'd give is I visited a handful of fairly small Polish cities a few years ago, and even though I knew nothing about them, actually they were very livable. Their scale, they were just nice places to be, but there was nothing particularly special about them. And so there's this tension between, do you go the route of being a London or a New York, where actually some of that difference in specialization is inflationary and might crowd out livability? Or do you actually look for something like Bellville, which isn't at the center and maybe is not as specialized as Cape Town, but creates more opportunities for doing things differently? So I think it depends entirely on what you're wanting to achieve. So I don't think you have to have it. It gives you certain things, but it's not a necessary ingredient to a place being livable.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. I think that does summarize it. I see we do have one comment about how we integrate and create social and cultural integration across previous barriers. It's difficult. It really is difficult. I think I mentioned at the outset that Bellville is a complete melting pot of cultural diversity. And I cannot stress that enough. It is probably the most beautiful thing about Bellville, that we have such a diverse cultural environment, diverse people, diverse colors, diverse tastes and foods and feelings and fabrics. And it's just an amazing place. How we integrate and make people feel welcome, and it, for me, goes around communication and sharing. It's not an easy thing to do. It's not something that we can do in isolation. We have to do it together. Alex's campaign around Better Bellville Together has been curated specifically around the together word. And I think any city around the world, and we've talked a lot about Bellville, but it really does apply to anywhere, needs to be built with its citizens at heart and engagement with those citizens to drive what that city brand is, what that identity is, and build on that. So that's my summation. I'm going to give everybody a quick closeout sentence. Alex, your turn to start before we say goodbye to everyone.
Sure. I'm a bit on the spot now. I don't have closing, sorry.
Get involved. Just say get involved.
Yeah, just get involved and come and join us on the streets, and we can really collectively move the perception of Bellville to one that is fantastic.
Tanya?
So I think probably the one thing I can leave off with is that, you know, we can come from our various backgrounds, but ultimately we're all human, and you can always come back to thinking, what would make me want to be in that space? So, and that's your starting point. Why would I want to live in Bellville? As a kind of
Perfect. Peter, you got the last word.
Yeah, there's no pressure there. I mean, I think I've really enjoyed listening to Alex and Tanya and just seeing all like the incredible work that's going on to changing a particular place in the world. So it's very encouraging to see and quite exciting to see. And I think maybe reflecting on this, I might bring another B in. So Brixton in South London, which, 20 years ago was a distressed neighborhood where people didn't necessarily want to be. You go back before that, actually, it was a very up and coming neighborhood. And it's great to see, in a sense, Bellville being that transition from decline to success being so tightly and expertly managed. So really looking forward to see what happens.
Thanks. Thank you, Peter. And thanks, Tanya and Alex. I really appreciated your time in sharing your insights and sharing your expertise. To all of those who did check in and listen to our webinar, thank you for your time. We really appreciate it. We thank you for the comments and the questions that came out of that. To Daniel at Future Cities Africa, thank you for the coordination. And I know all of these recordings will be available on both the GTP site as well as Daniel's Future Cities Africa. We'll be sharing that. Those links will be available. Hillary, for behind the scenes work, thank you. And we wish you guys a joyous Friday and a wonderful weekend ahead, wherever you may be. So thank you very, very much.